I've lived alone in this house 9 years, and I am not afraid in it. Not of the dark, not of the noises, not of going down in the night. I'm Walter, 82, retired carpenter, 9 years on my own since I lost my Helen. If you lie awake listening to your own house the way I used to, this one is for you. Start with number 1 and stay for number 4, because that's the night I stopped being afraid altogether. Number 1, there's a light in my kitchen window and it is on by 6:30 every morning. And if it isn't, a woman named Elaine Poulin drives up this road to find out why. That's the whole of it. That's the first habit, and it took about 4 minutes to arrange. Elaine lives half a mile down. She's 74 and she goes past my place most mornings. And about 5 years ago, I asked whether she'd mind noticing if my kitchen light was on. She said she'd already been doing it for 2 years. Sit with that a moment, because I did. She'd been checking on an old man every morning for 2 years without telling him, because telling him would have been an insult, and she knew it. What we did that afternoon was make it official and make it mutual. She has a key to this house and I have a key to hers. Light on by 6:30 here. Her kitchen curtain open by 8. Either one's wrong, the other one comes. It costs nothing. No monthly payment, no button round my neck, and nothing to be embarrassed about, because I'm watching her house exactly as much as she's watching mine. That's what makes it work. The moment it runs both ways, it stops being an old man being looked after and becomes two neighbors with an arrangement. And a man will accept an arrangement long after he's stopped accepting help. If you're walking this road alone, subscribe so you don't have to walk it alone. All right, number 2. Number 2. I know every single sound this house makes, and I know them because I sat down and learned them on purpose. Now that sounds like an odd way to spend an evening, and I'll tell you how it started, because it started badly. It was the second winter after Helen died, and I woke at about 2:10 to a noise downstairs. A knock, or a step, something with weight in it, in the front of the house. And I lay in that bed with my heart going, and I listened, and it came again. I got up. I went to the shop side of the landing, and I took a claw hammer off the shelf on the wall, which is not a thing I'm proud of, and I'll come back to it. And I went down those 13 stairs in the dark, one at a time, in a house I built with my own hands in 1971, with a hammer in my fist. It was the ice. There's a place under the front sill where the ground heaves in a hard freeze, and when it goes below about 10 degrees, it lifts and settles, and it makes a sound that is, I promise you, exactly the sound of a man's boot on a floorboard. I stood in my own front hall at 2:30 in the morning, and I laughed at myself, and then I sat down on the bottom stair, and I did not feel like laughing at all. Because what I'd just done was walk down a flight of stairs at 75 years of age, in the dark, holding a hammer, to confront something that was not there. And the most likely outcome of that entire performance was not catching anybody. It was falling. So the next day I started making a list. That's the habit. I went through this house, every room, every season, and I wrote down what makes noise and when and why. The frame ticks. A wooden house does that when the temperature drops fast in the evening. It's the joints working, and on a January night going from 20 above to 10 below, you can hear this whole building settle in a series of small reports over about an hour. The third stair creaks and has since 1978. The east window rattles in a north wind and does not in a west one, which means I can tell you which way the weather's coming from at 2 in the morning without getting up. The stovepipe pings for about 20 minutes after the fire dies down, and the ice under the front sill, twice a winter, which is a boot on a floorboard. Now, I've been reading about this sort of thing for years, and I keep the clippings in a drawer out in the workshop. And the thing that struck me most in all of it is that fear and not knowing are very nearly the same substance. A noise you can name is weather. The identical noise, unnamed, is a man in your front hall. And the mind will always fill an unnamed noise with the worst available candidate. That isn't a flaw in you, and it isn't nerves. It's an old piece of equipment doing precisely what it was built to do. And arguing with it at 2 in the morning is a waste of an argument. Nothing changed in this house, not one board. What changed is that I did the work of learning it, and the house went quiet, not in sound, in meaning. I hear that ice every winter now. It comes about the second week of January, and it comes again in February. And I lie in that bed, and I think, there's the sill, and I go back to sleep. And I'd say to anybody who wants to do this, it takes about a month and you do it by accident. You don't set aside an evening for it. You simply start asking every time you hear something, what was that? And then going and finding out in daylight the following afternoon. I found the ice by lying under the front sill with a torch in April. I found the stovepipe by sitting in that room deliberately after letting a fire go out. The east window I worked out over 2 winters by noticing which nights it did it and which nights it didn't, and then checking the weather in the morning. That's not detective work. That's a man being curious about his own house instead of frightened of it, and those 2 states cannot occupy the same room at the same time, which may be the most useful thing I know. And the hammer went back on the shelf in the shop where it belongs, and it has stayed there, and getting rid of that particular habit did more for my nights than anything else on this list except number 4. Before the next one, tell me in the comments what your house does at night. The noise you've never quite identified. I genuinely like to read those, and I'd wager half of them have an ordinary explanation that somebody in the comments will know. I read every single one, and I answer as many as these old hands allow. And if this is helping you, that thumbs up tells YouTube to show it to somebody else lying awake tonight. And I'd add one thing before I leave number 2, because somebody will be listening to this in a house that isn't 50 years old. I've got an advantage you may not have. I built this house. I know what's behind every wall in it because I put it there in 1971, and that makes the learning easier for me than it would be for a man who moved into a place at 70. But it doesn't make it impossible for him, and I'd say it makes it more worth doing rather than less. Because the noises in a house you don't know are the worst kind. Everything is unexplained, so everything is a candidate. And a man in that position is not going to solve it by lying still and hoping, and he's certainly not going to solve it by getting up with a hammer. He solves it the same way I did. One noise at a time in daylight over a season, until the list of unexplained things is short enough to sleep next to. Ask somebody if you've got somebody to ask. A son who's handy. A neighbor who's lived on that street 40 years and has heard the same thing from her own bed. There is nearly always somebody who knows what that pipe does in October, and there is no shame whatever in asking, and the asking is a good deal cheaper than the alternative. Number 3, I have thought through in detail on an ordinary afternoon exactly what I would do if I went down and couldn't get up. And I want to be careful here, so let me say this plainly first. Now, this is only a carpenter's opinion. For anything about your health, your bones, your balance, any of it, you talk to your doctor, not to an old man on the internet. I'm not qualified, and I'd not pretend to be. What I can tell you about is the thinking, because the thinking is a carpenter's business, and I've done a fair amount of it. Here's what I noticed about myself around 78. I was afraid of falling. Not constantly, but it was in there, running underneath, every time I went up a ladder or out on the ice or down into the cellar. And the fear was doing nothing useful whatsoever. It wasn't making me careful. It was just sitting there, taxing me. So I did what I do, which is that I got specific about it. I went out to that shop on an afternoon in October and I lay down on the floor. I'd like to be clear that I know how that sounds. An 80-year-old man lying on his own workshop floor on purpose, in the middle of the afternoon, with nothing wrong with him. But I wanted to know. I lay there and I worked out what I could see from down there, what I could reach, how I'd get to the door, whether I could get up on my own from that particular spot, which I could that day, though I'd not bet on it in 5 years. And I found out 3 things in about 20 minutes on that floor. The first is that my telephone was on the bench, 4 feet up and 8 feet away, which is the same as being in Portland. The second is that the shop door opens inward, and if I were on the floor near it, I could not have got it open, and I've since changed which way that door swings. And the third is that from flat on that floor, the only thing anybody outside could possibly see is that the light's on and the door's shut, which is exactly what it looks like when I'm working. So the phone lives in my pocket now. Every day, all day, in the shop and in the yard and when I'm splitting wood. Not on a table, not on a bench, in the pocket of my trousers. That's the whole of the practical part, and it cost me nothing but the 20 minutes. But the thing I actually want to tell you about number 3 is what it did to the fear, because that surprised me. It went. Not entirely and not forever, but the low constant hum of it went that afternoon, and it has not come back in the same way in 4 years. And I've thought a good deal about why, and the best I can put it is this. Fear is what you get when your mind has flagged something as important and unhandled. It'll keep raising it. That's its job, and it's not being unreasonable. The way to make it stop is not to be brave about it. It's to handle it out loud in daylight, once. Then it's been dealt with, and the mind lets it go. I'd been afraid of falling for 2 years because I had never once sat down and thought about falling. 20 minutes on a floor, and it was a solved problem instead of an open one. There's more to number 3 than the floor, and I'll give you the rest of what came out of it, because the floor was only where it started. Once I'd got specific about the shop, I found I couldn't stop, and I went round this whole house the same way over about a fortnight. The cellar stairs got a light switch at the top as well as the bottom, which they had wanted since 1971 and which I had been meaning to do for 50 years. The rug in the front hall went. I liked that rug. Helen bought it. It had a curl in one corner that I'd stepped over 10,000 times without thinking, and I took it up and rolled it and put it in the attic, and I'd be lying if I said that was an easy afternoon. The step out the back door got rebuilt with a wider tread, which is a 2-hour job in which I'd been going down sideways for 4 years. And I put a rail on the outside steps, which I did not want, and which I built myself out of ash, so that at least it was mine. Now, none of that is the interesting part. Anybody can list off jobs. The interesting part is what I noticed while I was doing it, and it's the reason number 3 is on this list at all. Every one of those things had been a small worry. Not a thought, a worry, the kind that runs underneath and never quite surfaces. Every time I went down those cellar stairs in the dark, some part of me registered it. Every single time I stepped over that curl in the rug, some part of me knew. And I had been paying that 20 or 30 times a day for years. I've been reading about this for a good while. The clippings are in that drawer with the rest. And one thing I came across put it in a way I've never forgotten. It said the difficulty with a hazard you've grown used to is that you stop seeing it and you don't stop reacting to it. The seeing goes, the reacting doesn't. That was exactly it. I'd stopped noticing that rug in about 2009, and I'd gone on stepping over it every day for 15 years. And when it was gone, the hall felt different in a way I could not have explained to anybody. So the fortnight of jobs did not make me safer, particularly. A rug is a rug. What it did was clear out about 20 small unhandled things that had been quietly running in the background of a man's day. And a man with nothing running in the background sleeps differently. That I can tell you for certain, because I have been both. What I'd offer to anybody is this. Walk your own house on an ordinary afternoon with a pencil and write down every place where you go carefully. Not where it's dangerous, where you go carefully. That's a different list, and it's the honest one, because your body has already made it and never told you. Then fix them, all of them, over a fortnight in daylight at your own pace, as jobs rather than as concessions. You'll be surprised how many there are, and you'll be more surprised at what it does to the evenings. There's one more piece of number 3, and it's about winter, because I live where I live. Ice is the thing, not the cold. The cold is manageable and always was. Ice on a step at 7 in the morning with a load of wood in your arms is a different matter, and I've come near it twice. So there's a bucket of sand by the back door from November to April. Not salt, sand, because salt works when it's warm enough and does nothing at all at 10 below, which is precisely when you need it. And the rule I made with myself, which I'll admit took some swallowing, is that I don't carry wood and go down a step at the same time. The wood goes down first, onto the step, and then I go down, and then I pick it up. It adds about 40 seconds to every load, and it looks ridiculous, and there's nobody to see it. I got that from a fellow at the diner, incidentally. 88 years old, sharp as anything, been doing it for a decade. He told me the trick, and I thought it was fussy, and then I tried it for a winter, and now I'd not do it any other way. That's how nearly everything on this list arrived, come to that. Not from a book, and certainly not from me being clever. From another old man who'd already worked it out, mentioned in passing over a cup of coffee on a Saturday morning. Which is one more argument for getting out of the house if you needed another. And there's one thing I'd put alongside all of that, which isn't about the house at all. I tested something on myself for 3 whole months before I'd have told anyone about it, and it's this. I stopped doing anything difficult after dark. Not everything. I'm not sitting in a chair from 4 o'clock, but the ladder work, the cellar, the wood splitting, anything up on a stool, all of that finishes when the light goes, and in December, that means about 3:30. For years, I'd have told you that was giving in. A man works when there's work to do. 3 months of it, and here's what I found. I wasn't doing less. I was doing the same amount and starting earlier, because knowing there's a hard stop at dusk makes a man get out to that shop at 9 instead of 11. And the evenings change completely, because an evening where nothing difficult can happen is an evening you can actually sit down in. There's no bit of you thinking about the load of wood still out there. It's done, or it waits till morning, and either way, it isn't yours tonight. Helen used to say, I never do anything halfway, and she was right about this too. I'd been going out to that woodpile at 8 o'clock at night in January for about 40 years, and never once asked myself why. The answer, when I finally asked it, was that I'd always done it that way, and there had always been somebody in the house if it went wrong. There isn't now. And that changes the arithmetic on a dark step with an armload of ash. And it took me until 79 to work that out. And whatever it is that's sitting in you at 3 in the morning, take it out at 2 in the afternoon and look at it properly and decide what you'd actually do. It won't be as bad as the version you've got at night. Almost nothing is. We're one away from the one I promised you. Number 4, the night I stopped being afraid altogether. Stay with me. Number 4. The thing that finally made me unafraid in this house was not a lock, and it was not a light, and it was not anything I bought. It was that people know me. Let me tell you about a night in November, about 4 years ago, and then I'll explain what it did. I was in this chair. It was gone 11, which is late for me, and the fire was down to coals, and there was a bad storm going. One of those November ones that comes up the valley with wet snow in it. And somebody knocked on my front door. Nobody knocks on my front door. This house is at the end of a long driveway off a back road, and there is no reason for a human being to be at my front door at 11 o'clock at night in a storm. And I sat in this chair with my heart going exactly the way it went that night with the ice. And I want to say clearly what went through my head, because I think it goes through everybody's. Every single thing I had ever half heard about old people alone, and people at doors and what happens. All of it in about a second and a half. I got up and I answered it. There was a boy on my step, 20 years old, maybe 21, soaked through, no coat worth speaking of, shaking so badly he could barely get it out. He'd put his truck off the road about 300 yards down where the bank drops, and he'd walk to the first light he could see. The first light he could see was mine. I brought him in and put him by that fire and gave him a cup of tea, and we sat there about 40 minutes waiting on the fellow with the wrecker. He told me his mother's name and I knew her people. He was frightened and cold and about the least dangerous thing that has ever stood on that step. Now here's what I want you to notice, because I sat with this for a long while afterward. The thing I had been afraid of for years in the abstract, a stranger at the door at 11 at night in a storm, arrived. It actually happened. And when it happened, it was a 20-year-old boy who needed help, and I was the only man on that road awake with a fire going. That is the far more likely version. That is, in fact, the version that happens. And the other one lives almost entirely in the head. But that isn't the whole of number 4. Here's the rest of it. That boy knew to come here. Not to my house specifically. He came to a light. But he came up that driveway and knocked on a door in the middle of the night. Because in this part of the world, you can still do that. And the reason you can still do it is that people around here know each other. And it came to me, sitting up after he'd gone, that I had spent 2 years being frightened about who might come up that driveway. And the actual protection I had was not the lock on that door. It was that the Sullivans down the road know what time my lights go off. It's that Elaine has a key. It's that the fellow at the hardware store knows I'm building a chest of drawers and would think it's strange if I didn't come in for hinges. Now I want to be careful, because I can hear how this sounds and I'm not a fool about the world. I am not telling you to leave your door open. I'm not telling anybody in a city what to do about anything. I've lived my whole life on a back road in Maine, and I'd not presume. And if you're somewhere that a stranger at 11 at night is a genuine risk, then you know your own street, and I don't. And you should do exactly what you judge right. What I'm telling you is what happened to the fear, which is a separate matter from what happened to the risk. Because here's the thing I got badly wrong for 2 years. I had it in my head that being careful and being frightened were the same activity, that the fear was doing the protecting. It wasn't. The fear was doing nothing at all except keeping me awake and keeping me in. The protecting was being done by an arrangement about a kitchen light, a key on a hook in Elaine's kitchen, and about 6 people up and down this road with a rough idea of what my week looks like. Those 2 things had come completely apart, and I hadn't noticed. And when I did notice, I could put the fear down and keep the care. And that is the whole of number 4 in one sentence. There's a second half to it that I only worked out later. For those 2 years I'd been pulling in, not answering the phone as often, saying no to things, keeping the door shut. Every one of those felt like a sensible precaution at the time. And every single one of them was making me less safe. That's the part that turns the whole business round. A man who pulls in has fewer people who know his patterns, fewer people who'd notice, fewer keys on fewer hooks. He is, in the plainest terms, less protected every month he goes on doing it. And it feels like the opposite the entire time, because it feels like caution. I had a friend named Frank, lost his wife 4 years before I lost mine. Same town, same age, near enough the same trade. And Frank pulled in quietly, reasonably, over about 2 years, and every step of it would have looked sensible from inside. He died at 76, and the hard part of that isn't the dying. The hard part is that nobody knew for a while, because he'd spent 2 years teaching everybody that Frank keeps to himself. Frank was not careless. Frank was careful in exactly the wrong direction, and I very nearly went the same way. And the only reason I didn't is that a woman half a mile down the road was stubborn about a kitchen light. So that's what I'd want anybody to take from number 4. The lock on your door is worth having, and I've got one. But it is not what's keeping you safe, and it is certainly not what will make you calm. What makes you calm is being known. It's the postman who'd think it odd, the neighbor with the key, the boy who knows there's a light at the top of the driveway, a woman who has driven past your kitchen window every morning for 7 years and would turn in if it were dark. None of that comes from pulling in. All of it comes from the opposite, and it is the least intuitive thing on this list and the truest. And I'll tell you the practical form of it, since I've been going on about principles. Be predictable. That's the whole method. I am at that diner in town on a Saturday morning, not most Saturdays, every Saturday, and I've been doing it 4 years, and there are about 9 people who would notice if I weren't. I don't sit with them. Half of them I've never had a proper conversation with. It doesn't matter in the slightest. My kitchen light is on by 5:30. My truck goes down that driveway on a Tuesday for the shopping. My chimney smokes from about 5 in the morning in the winter, and anybody driving this road at that hour has seen it for 50 years. None of that is a system, and none of it costs me anything. It's a man living the same week over and over in a place where people can see him, and it means the shape of my life is legible from the road. A legible life is a protected life. That's the whole of what I've got, and I'd trade a great deal of hardware for it. And here's the last thing about number 4, which is the reason I put it in the position I did. The night that boy knocked, I had a choice in about 2 seconds. And I want to be honest that the choice was not obvious to me at the time. I had been the sort of man who wouldn't have answered for about 2 years, and I had reasons, every one of which sounded like sense. If I'd been that man on that particular night, a 20-year-old would have gone back down that driveway into a storm with no coat and walked another 1.5 miles to the next light. He'd probably have been all right. Probably. And I'd have sat in this chair with the door shut, feeling careful, and never once known what I'd done. That's what fear costs. And the bill doesn't come to you. That's the thing about it. The bill goes to somebody else. A boy in a storm, a neighbor you didn't ring, a son who stopped calling because there was never any point. I answered the door. It's the single best thing I've done in this house in 9 years, and it took 2 seconds, and I very nearly didn't. His mother wrote to me afterward. A proper letter on paper about a fortnight later. She got my name off the wrecker fellow. She said he told her there was an old man at the top of a driveway with a fire going who didn't ask him a single question before bringing him in. I've got that letter in the drawer of the desk in the front room with lilies. And I'll tell you what it's worth to a man who lives alone, to have it in writing somewhere that on one particular night, he was the light at the top of the driveway rather than the frightened old fellow behind the door. That's what number 4 bought me. Not safety exactly, something better than safety. A man who is known as a difficult man to do anything to. That's the plain truth of it, and it is the exact opposite of what fear tells you. Because fear tells you to lock up and pull in and see nobody. I've been reading about this for years. A program on the radio put me onto it originally, and I couldn't let it go. And what it kept coming back to is that the isolated ones are the vulnerable ones. Not the ones with weaker locks. The ones nobody would miss for 4 days. And that reframed the whole business for me, because the safest I have ever been in this house is not the winter I was most careful. It's now when the door is answered, when a neighbor has a key, when a boy in a storm can knock and get a cup of tea, when 6 people would notice inside of a day if something went wrong here. I let people in. That's the habit. It sounds like the opposite of a safety habit, and it is the single most effective one I've got. And I'll tell you what it did to the nights, which is what I promised you at the start. I stopped listening. That's the change. For 2 years, I lay in that bed, and I listened to this house. Not deliberately, I couldn't help it. Some part of me was on duty all night, every night. And a man on duty does not sleep properly, and I did not sleep properly for 2 years, and I put it down to grief. And some of it was grief, and a good deal of it was that I was standing guard over a house I was frightened of. I don't listen anymore. The house makes its noises, and I know what they are. And there are people up and down this road who would come, and I go to sleep like a man who has nothing to watch. 9 years alone in this house, and the last 4 of them I have slept better than I did at 50 with a business to run. Number 5. And this is the last one, and it's the quietest, and it took me until about the 7th year to work it out. The deepest fear isn't the noise, and it isn't the fall, and it isn't the door. It's dying alone. That's the one underneath. And I don't think most people my age say it out loud, and I've decided to say it out loud tonight because I'd have liked somebody to say it to me. Here is what I did about it, and I want to be honest that it's a strange sort of remedy, and it worked completely. I sat down at that kitchen table on an ordinary evening. Nothing wrong, nothing pending, a Tuesday in February with the fire going. And I wrote down what I'd want, not a will. That was done years back with a proper man in Bangor, and it isn't what I mean. I mean the small things. Who gets rung first, and that it should be David, and that he should ring his sister, rather than her hearing it from anybody else. That I'd want the shop left as it is for a while, not cleared out in the first week. That there's a hardbound notebook in the desk drawer in the front room with 60 of Helen's phrases in it, in my handwriting, and that it goes to Lily and to nobody else. That they're to sell this house and not keep it out of sentiment, and I've told them that more than once. And that if I'm found out there in that shop, they're not to make it into a tragedy, because a man of 80-something going down in a workshop he built with a piece of cherry on the bench has had a considerably better end than most, and I'd want that said at the time. I wrote it on a sheet of the yellow legal pad I keep in the kitchen drawer. Took about an hour and a half. It was a poor evening, and I'd rather have been reading. I gave it to both of them the following spring. And here's the thing that happened, and it's the reason it's number 5 and the reason I've saved it for last. I stopped being afraid of dying alone, not because it became less likely. It's exactly as likely as it was. I live at the end of a long driveway and I'm 82, and that arithmetic hasn't moved an inch. What went was something else, and it took me a while to work out what. I was never actually afraid of the dying part. I'd made my peace with that some years ago, and I'd not have said otherwise even before the notebook. What I was afraid of was the mess, of my children arriving to a house nobody had thought about, of Susan having to guess, of David standing in that shop not knowing whether his father would have wanted it cleared, of the two of them, in the worst week of their lives, having to make 40 small decisions with no idea what I'd have said about any of them. That's what was sitting on me at 3 in the morning for 9 years, and I'd never once put a name to it, and it wasn't fear of death at all. It was a man not wanting to leave his children a difficult afternoon. An hour and a half at a kitchen table, and it was handled. Now, I know that's a difficult thing to sit down to, and I'd not pretend otherwise. I put it off for a good while, and I only did it in the end because David and I had had a conversation about the house that got about halfway there and then stopped. So I'd say 2 things to anybody thinking about it. The first is that it's easier written than said. I could not have had that conversation out loud in one go. On paper, alone, at my own table, at my own pace with nobody's face in front of me. That I could do, and the paper did the talking afterward. The second is that you'll find it's shorter than you expect. I'd braced for something enormous. It came to a page and a half of a legal pad, and about a third of it was practical, and the rest of it was just telling my children how to feel about a thing, which is possibly overstepping, and which I did anyway. And when I gave it to them in the spring at that table, Susan cried and David read it twice and put it in his coat pocket and said almost nothing. He rang me about a week later on a Tuesday, which was not his day, and he said, "I'm glad you did that." That was the whole conversation. 4 words. And that man is 58 years old and does not say things easily. And I've thought about those 4 words more than most of what's been said to me in 9 years. Because what I'd actually handed him was not instructions. It was permission to stop wondering. And the calm that came after that is not bravery. I want to be plain about it because I don't want anybody thinking there's some quality I've got that they haven't. There's nothing brave about me. I've been frightened in this house more times than I've told you tonight. The calm is just what's left when there's nothing outstanding. And I want to say the last of it about Helen, because she's been in this from the start, and I've kept her out of most of it on purpose tonight. She was not afraid of much. That was simply her. She'd go down into that cellar in the dark for a jar of something and not think about it. And I'd be standing at the top of the stairs saying, "Take the torch." And she'd say something over her shoulder that I won't repeat. And for 54 years I had that in the house with me. And I did not understand that a good deal of what I thought was my own steadiness was actually hers. When she went, it went. That's the honest account of the first 2 years. I was not a brave man discovering he was frightened, I was a man finding out that the courage in that house had never been evenly divided and the larger share had just left. So everything I've told you tonight is a man building back, on his own, out of ordinary materials, a thing his wife used to supply for free. She'd find that funny. She'd find the hammer business particularly funny, and I'd have heard about it for years. And I'd give a great deal to be laughed at about it once more. That's the whole of what I've learned about being unafraid at 82, and it's the same thing 5 times over. Fear is the mind holding up something that hasn't been dealt with. Deal with it once in daylight, in specifics, and it puts it down. So, 5 habits: a light in the window and a neighbor with a key. Learning every sound your house makes so a noise is weather instead of a man. 20 minutes on a workshop floor working out what you'd actually do. Letting people know you, because a man who is known is a hard man to do anything to. And an hour and a half at a kitchen table settling the thing nobody wants to write down. Not one of those cost me money. 4 of them cost me an afternoon. I'm 82 years old. I live at the end of a long driveway in a cold part of the country, in a house I put up with my own hands in 1971, with nobody in it but me and nobody coming. And I sleep with the window open in June and the fire banked in January and the door unlocked more often than my son would like, which he mentions and which I listen to and which I'll probably do something about eventually. There's a kitchen light that goes on at 5:30. There's a bucket of sand by the back door. There's a page and a half of yellow paper in a drawer in Portland. That's the whole of my security, and it has been enough for 9 years. None of it came from a catalog. All of it came from other old men over coffee, a woman half a mile down the road, and about 4 afternoons of thinking properly about things I'd spent years not thinking about at all. 9 years, and I am not afraid in this house. If tonight is one of the hard ones, if the 3 in the morning sort of night is the trouble rather than the noises, I made another talk about exactly that, about what that hour does to a man and what I do when it comes for me. It's right there on the screen. The kettle's still warm. I'll see you there.